Hey team, happy Monday. It is the second to last day of school and the last Monday of our whole school year, which is wild to think about. I hope you had an awesome weekend and you're refreshed and ready to start your day. Okay, today we're going to be talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I know that sometimes reading about a law or an act can be way less exciting than reading about an actual person that you can really learn a lot about. But this is a really important act and it changed the lives of a lot of people, right up to changing the lives of people like us today. Okay, so while we're reading, make sure that you have a pencil and paper and make sure you're pausing me at the end of every section so you can write down your own thoughts about each section and then compare them with my thoughts. All right, let's begin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a law that made history in the United States of America. The effort took many years and the work of leaders all around the country. This is we already saw this photo. It's the president signing the Civil Rights Act with Martin Luther King looking on. But today we're going to learn a little bit more about it. The background of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil War ended in 1865. Laws were passed to end slavery and to improve the lives of African Americans in the U.S. However, the laws were not always put into action. Many Southern states passed laws that made life even more difficult for African Americans. Jim Crow laws kept Black and white people separate in the South. This was known as segregation. African Americans were barred from classrooms, bathrooms, train cars, restaurants, and other public places. States even made it difficult for African Americans to vote. Let's pause and see what the main idea was of this section. Most of us have read about it before, but what is the section telling us about um, the background of why the Civil Rights Act was important? All right. I think that the main idea is that the South was segregated after the Civil War. That means even though it was decided that slavery would no longer happen in the United States, the South was still segregated. And Jim Crow laws kept Black people separated unfairly and made their lives much worse. Let's move on. The Civil Rights Movement. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation laws were wrong. Citizens joined together. They encouraged the government to take action on civil rights issues. Now, we've seen a lot of photos like this, and they're really similar to some of the protest photos you've probably seen of protests happening in the last couple days and weeks of the Black Lives Matter protests. A lot of people marching together, although people today are less likely to march in suits, holding up signs about what they're about what they want to have. And this is a civil rights movement march in 1963. The civil rights movement began. People broke laws peacefully. Martin Luther King Jr. Became a civil rights leader. He supported nonviolence. King encouraged love over hate. All around the country, Black people and many white people demanded equality for all. So let's pause and see what the main idea was of this section. All right. So here I wrote that the civil rights movement was when people advocated for equal treatment for Black and white people, and that there were many peaceful protests. That's which is true. Okay, let's keep moving. The Civil Rights Act gains steam. If something gains steam, it's kind of like an old saying because if a train gains steam, that would mean that the train was going faster. Anyways, the Civil Rights Act gained steam, which means it got faster and bigger. Nonviolent protests of the civil rights movement continued. Sadly, they were met with police brutality. Some police even used dogs, clubs, and high pressure fire hoses against protesters. This caused President Kennedy to take action in 1963. He suggested the Civil Rights Act. He said that the United States will not be fully free until all of its citizens are free. This is a wrong photo. President Kennedy was killed before the Civil Rights Act could be passed. Lyndon B. Johnson took over as president. After some time, the act finally passed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happened in this paragraph. Pause me and write down your summary. Okay, so I wrote down that protests continued, and that even though protesters were peaceful, the police were harmful and hurt people. The Civil Rights Act said that all citizens should have equal rights. So this might seem a little bit similar to the protests we're hearing about and maybe participating in today, where the protests themselves are usually marches or sit-ins or different types of peaceful movements where a bunch of people come together asking for the same thing. But here you can see that just like they are today, where police are being unfair to people who are not doing anything to them, police were using dogs and clubs, which is like a big bat, and fire hoses against protesters to try to get the protesters to stop protesting. And this is really unfair because it's not fair to use violence when the people who are protesting are not using violence. Um, but I digress. It also said that the Civil Rights Act was passed by President Johnson, and the Civil Rights Act said that citizens should have equal rights. Our last section is right here. Accomplishments of the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 declared that segregation based on race, national origin, or religion was against the law. This was enforced in all public places. The law also began the desegregation of schools. We already talked about Ruby Bridges last week. At the time, most Black schools were in rundown buildings. They were denied basic resources like pencils and paper. The Civil Rights Act was a huge step forward. It opened the door in the future to equal rights for all. Pause the video and write down your observations on this section. All right. So my summary of this section is that the Civil Rights Act ended legal segregation, so no longer it was now illegal to separate people based on the color of their skin, and began the work of making a more equal country. And I think it's important to remember, are things equal in America? Absolutely not. Just like the Civil War didn't solve the problem of Black people being oppressed, the Civil Rights Act did not solve the problem of Black and white people not having the same amount of rights or not having equal rights. But it was a really important first step to make it illegal to segregate people and to give white people better resources. So it was the beginning of, that's why I wrote the beginning of work of making a more equal country, because we are still working to make a more equal country, because that has not yet happened today. And it requires that we all work together to make that possible in the future. All right, let's review and see what our point of view might be. I think that the point of view here is pretty easy to tell, but let's review our notes anyways. Remember, the point of view is what the author thinks and feels about the topic. All right, this section told me that the South was segregated after the Civil War, and Jim Crow laws kept Black people separated and made their lives worse. This tells me that the Civil Rights Movement was when people advocated for equal treatment for Black people and that there were a lot of peaceful protests. This section tells me that the police were harmful and hurt people, and that the Civil Rights Act was passed in response to all of those protests and the movements. And then the last section says that the Civil Rights Act ended legal segregation and began the work of making a more equal country. So pause me and write down what you think the author's point of view is, and I'll do the same. Okay, I wrote that the Civil Rights Act was an important piece of law that made it illegal to segregate people in America, and it was made possible because of protests and lots of people working together. All right, folks, that's all for Monday. Have a great rest of your day.